I'm Wiley Combs, the editor-in-chief of News from Nowhere, and this is the next in our series of video interviews for This is Laramie. Tonight we're interviewing the executive director of the Alliance for Historic Wyoming, CarlyAnn Anderson. Hi, Carly.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us tonight.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And so this is going to be a pretty impromptu interview because I had no idea what the Alliance for Historic Wyoming was before we talked 15 minutes before the interview. So let's start off with that. What exactly is the Alliance for Historic Wyoming?
The Alliance for Historic Wyoming is a statewide nonprofit dedicated to protecting Wyoming's historic places and spaces. And so we work around the state on a variety of cultural resources, everything from historic trails that span the whole length of Wyoming to things like historic schools, historic barns, and then prehistoric Native American sites as well.
And you're headquartered?
In Laramie, Wyoming.
And how did that end up happening? Is that just kind of luck of the draw, or?
I was living here when I got the job, and Trey Sherwood, who works with the Laramie Main Street Alliance, was kind enough to partner with the Alliance for Historic Wyoming and offers us office space down here at 207 East Grand in historic downtown Laramie.
And how long have you been in this capacity as executive director? How long have you been in this capacity as executive director?
Almost 3 years exactly.
Okay, and what was your experience that led you to get this job? Do you have like a history background, or how did you end up getting into this position?
So I have a degree in American Studies and Environment and Natural Resources, and I had written my thesis on cultural resource management when it comes to dealing with energy landscapes, which of course Wyoming has many. So taking a look at things like wind farms and transmission lines, things that cover a lot of Wyoming's open spaces, which of course are filled with historic and cultural resources, among other things. So this was really kind of a nice fit just to plug in with the way that historic and cultural resources are managed in the state and talk about why they're important to our heritage and to our future.
So in that vein, how do you ensure that these things are preserved? What kind of projects do you work on?
Definitely. I would say there's no true insurance. I mean, things always happen, but we try really hard to give people the tools that they need to protect the places that they love. So we have things ranging from toolkits. So if there's a historic school, for instance, in your community that's being threatened with demolition or that you need to find a new use for, we have this toolkit that you can work through as a community and as sort of a grassroots leader to come up with ideas and kind of build that momentum behind a building. We also come up with grants for people, kind of to connect them to the right resources that they might need. Mm-hmm. So it really is a wide toolbox, I would say, a number of things that go into it.
Okay, so can you give me some examples of where you've given people this toolbox or how this has come to play in some sort of specific environment?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say just because we're here in Laramie today, we've definitely helped several downtown business owners. I know that Kim Vincent over at the Herb House has talked to us a lot of times. She's really interested in doing a facade grant and taking her building, she's currently covered in stucco, and so taking that facade back to a more historic look. And so I'd say one of the kind of best examples of what that means is the building over on 3rd and Ivinson, the Handel Ludwig building. So they actually received a Historic Architecture Assistance Fund, which is a grant that we help manage with the state of Wyoming through their Historic Preservation Organization and also with the Wyoming Main Street program. And it just helps connect historic preservation architects, people who specialize in all of these old buildings, connect with the property owners to really develop a plan. And so those guys have been working on their building for something like 3 years now, and finally, we got to see the facade come off and this beautiful 1920s building come back out.
Well, that building does look nice.
It does. It's kind of incredible.
But, obviously you guys don't just do stuff here in Laramie. What are some other projects you've done throughout the state? Maybe some big accomplishments that you'd like to talk about?
Definitely. So one of our bigger initiatives is with historic schools. Wyoming is sort of flush with education money, and a lot of that means, I think the first thing that comes to people's mind is having a new school in the best kind of educational environment. And we're really firm believers that the building you're in doesn't have to dictate that education program, and we think it's kind of great to have neighborhood schools and have these things that students can walk to, and that maybe it is okay for kids to have windows to look out of. So we really tried to put a big push forward to save some of Wyoming's historic schools. And that has worked out really well in some communities. Natrona County High School is probably one of the shining examples of that. A great 1920s, very castle-like building that's still there, partly because of our efforts. But again, it goes back to really getting that community-driven effort going. We're also currently doing a project on Carnegie Libraries in Wyoming. Our Cowboy Carnegies program celebrates the 16 Carnegie Libraries that were built throughout the state, and Wyoming has lost almost half of those due to demolition and other unfortunate circumstances. And so we're really just trying to highlight the remaining structures and talk about what they add to our communities.
Okay. So maybe we should talk about what's your funding model like? How is your organization organized?
Yes, we have a really healthy donor base. Again, grassroots. So we really like to say that Wyoming citizens are the ones who are in charge of what Wyoming's future looks like, and we really believe that everybody sort of has a preservationist in them. So you might not really associate with the word historic preservation, but you know that growing up at your grandparents' farm was really exciting. You loved that old barn, or you liked the historic school you went to. There's always some kind of story that ties us to place.
Right.
So we really try to lean on that and connect people to our cause. So that's a major source of our funding. We also do have a lot of private grants that come through from various things around the state and some national organizations. One of the biggest groups we work with is the Conservation Lands Foundation. So they're in charge of advocating for national conservation lands, which is sort of like the BLM's program for the national parks. It's that same level of protection for some of these lands. Mm-hmm. And so all of Wyoming's historic trails corridors fall under that category. So we do a lot of work with them, just trying to advocate. And then we also do have some federal funding streams. We have a cooperative service agreement with the National Park Service up in Grand Teton National Park. So we have an archaeologist who works with us and kind of ties us together with the park, where obviously a lot of major preservation is happening.
So I would imagine, since you're talking about preservation within these multiple spheres of jurisdiction, you might come into conflict with certain organizations. Would you like to talk about how this overlap between, say, the BLM or private landowners interfaces with what your organization does?
Definitely. I think we try to maintain sort of a really healthy balance of just recognizing that a lot of these historic and cultural resources are only there once. Once you tear up a segment of a historic trail, you don't get it back. So we really try to emphasize that we'd like to just avoid these cultural resources to begin with. And then, of course, there are federal processes in place for when you cannot avoid a resource. And so then there are mitigation projects that kick in. And we work pretty closely with all of the federal agencies to comment on those projects. And the next most important part of all of that is, again, getting those citizens involved, because no matter what your stance is on public lands, they really do belong to us, and most of them have sort of an obligation to have multiple use driven on that land. So we just, I would say, emphasize how all of these things can work together if you're careful about planning and sort of know what you're dealing with before you start a project.
So how do you decide which projects to focus on then?
Basically, how many resources we have, and then there is sort of a hierarchy to say, again, the national trails are what we've been focused on for the last 11 years, mm-hmm. So that definitely kind of rises high on our list. But it also comes from projects that someone asks us to be involved with. If someone comes to us and really needs help and makes a good case for it, we're always willing to jump in.
Okay. Why don't you remind our viewers, literate though they may be in the history of Wyoming, what some of the national historic trails are that pass through this state?
Yes, so we have the Oregon, California, and Mormon Historic Corridor is some of the biggest. And so these are, if you went to Guernsey as a student, got to see those trail ruts just ground through all of the sandstone layers, that's that trail.
And all of the swallows that are nesting.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
Okay.
And so of course, that travels all the way across the state through places like Split Rock, and South Pass is really the most critical point on all of those trails because it was the easiest crossing over the Rocky Mountains. Mm-hmm. So it was the way west. And then if you look at the maps of historic trails going across Wyoming, they also go north, south, all of the directions. Just because we're kind of in the middle of the nation, it's easy to get to a lot of places from where we are. Mm-hmm. And that's evidenced by the fact that we still have interstates crossing and highways crossing, right, and airmail routes, kind of the whole 9 yards as far as transportation resources go.
So what about like the Pony Express?
Yep, we definitely do Pony Express stuff. And a lot of that, again, they all fall in the same corridors, which makes that federal mitigation process all the more important, because mm-hmm. you're not just messing with one resource, you're kind of messing up the entire route.
So I have to ask, what was happening with all of these trails and these places before this organization existed? Were people just like trampling all over them and dumping garbage there, or what? I
was going to say, I don't think it's been that extreme consistently. There's definitely been some big snafus over the years, but there are other advocacy organizations. There's the Oregon California Trail Association. The Mormon Church is very involved in preserving the heritage that trail represents for their people. So I would say that we are certainly not the first, and we certainly won't be the last to really help represent all of these resources.
So what would you, let's say hypothetically, what would happen if somebody wanted to build some electrical transmission lines from a wind farm across one of these historic trails?
Yes, what if?
Not that would ever happen. But in
No,
the
it certainly
future.
has happened. Chokecherry Sierra Madre is one of the biggest projects we've worked on recently, and that is the Overland Trail, which is a more southern route but still goes cross country. And the Overland route is really difficult because it's in the checkerboard pattern that the railroad created, and so there really is a mix of private and public land, and it gets messy quickly. But that was one gigantic energy project that's really crisscrossing a lot of historic and cultural resources. And so that's the largest mitigation project we've worked on in probably the last few years, and we're starting up on more now that Chokecherry Sierra Madre is sort of coming together. But yeah, we got a lot of mitigation proposals out of that, just to say, you really are disrupting this landscape. Here's what you can do to help, even if we can't save the entire trail. And so educational programs come out of that. National Register nominations come out of that. We're doing a couple of field courses. And when I say we, this is a variety of partners, everybody from the national preservation organizations down to us.
So maybe that's a good opportunity to talk about how is your organization structured as far as the membership, or so you're headquartered here in Laramie.
We are.
But you do stuff throughout the state. There must be other members throughout the state, correct?
Yes. So we have a board that is distributed mostly throughout the state, and we currently have 8 members, and we do have a few open spots if anyone is interested in serving on that board. I think it's a really interesting group. We have a variety of people and some real preservation experts on that board, so it's fun to work with. And then our members are actually nationwide at this point. There's a lot of people who are interested in the trails, or who have lived in Wyoming and since moved away, or who love to come here on vacation, who have a vested interest in at least parts of Wyoming sort of staying the same. It's kind of a joke that, we're preserving the past for the future with what we do. But there's more information about our membership program on our website at historicwyoming.org. Our membership levels start at $20, and they get you access to events that we do throughout the summer, a quarterly newsletter, and all kinds of good resources.
You're good at this. I didn't even have to throw you that one. So let's talk real quick about a couple of these projects that we went over before. Would you like to speak about the barn preservation project, or what's with the barns?
Yes, what's with the barns? I like that. So barns just sort of fall into some of those resources that we're already always caring for. So it's just part of Wyoming's heritage that we have these barns spread throughout. So a few weeks ago now, we put up a post on, I think, what was National Ag Day about just some historic barns in Wyoming and projects that we'd worked on. And instead of reaching the normal several thousand people that our posts reach, this hit over 60,000 people, which is like a Facebook phenomenon. We'll never understand how we got those numbers, or maybe never reach them again. But that was really exciting to say, okay, barns are something that people really connect with, kind of on some basic level. And so that's kind of our new joke hashtag, is that people love barns. And
you were born in a barn.
Yeah, right. So I think we'll be building on that throughout the year. We're also just sort of recognizing that Wyoming is facing sort of an interesting energy bust boom cycle again here. Really wanting to recognize that Wyoming's heritage is so rooted in things like extraction. And so while we're usually sort of going up against extraction or resource development in order to protect these cultural resources, you have to recognize that at some point Salt Creek oil field, which is one of the biggest oil fields Wyoming has had, is really a cultural resource in itself. And so we'll be doing some pieces on refineries and coal mines and all of these other areas probably this fall.
Okay. I'm going to jump back to the Carnegie Libraries. Maybe you could explain real quick what the Carnegie Libraries are, where they're located, and what the importance of them is.
Definitely. So Carnegie Libraries are library buildings that were funded by Andrew Carnegie. He set up a foundation with all of the money he had made in steel, right?
Yes.
And distributed that to communities across the nation, and even some of them I think are in Scotland and Canada. And Wyoming was lucky enough to get 16 of these buildings built, which is actually a huge number for the population that we've always had. And so we are just kind of intrigued that that is a cultural resource in Wyoming. It's something that we have. We consider that a real asset for most of them are in historic downtowns. So it's kind of one of those iconic buildings like the courthouse or something might be. And so we want to make sure that communities can use these. They know how to sort of, leverage them as a cultural asset. and just to kind of give people a sense of the history that goes along with those. And that's really spurred by the fact that a few of these are sort of threatened just because no one necessarily knows what to do with the spaces and that we have already lost almost half of them. So what we did, we worked with the Wyoming Humanities Council to prepare a series of 5 exhibit boards, exhibit panels, and so those are currently traveling the state trying to get to some of the communities that had Carnegie Libraries. And we actually started here in Laramie. Our Carnegie building is of course on 4th and Grand and is currently city services, but we've also been in Evanston. We're on our way to Lusk later this year. There's quite a few of them to get to.
Okay. So now it's time for the pop quiz.
Great.
Actually, no, I'm not going to do that. But can you give us maybe in a brief, just a brief description why it's important for people to care about this historic preservation in Wyoming and why our state is so uniquely placed for that?
Definitely. So I guess my point is always, I think I already talked that I think everyone sort of has a thread of this preservation ethos running through them, that we can all recognize that there are special places that you would really hate to lose. And so I think that Wyoming is, like any other place, so important that all of our heritage is sort of written on the walls, literally. You can come to a historic downtown and realize that Laramie grew out from the railroad. That's really one of the only reasons we're here in the plains. So I think place is so important for sort of anchoring us and giving us a sense of who we are and where we've come from, and that it's also a really important piece of where we're going, that we don't have to just have minerals to offer, but we can do things that are rotated around tourism. I think there's a real economic benefit to historic preservation, and there's lots of numbers and studies to prove that, but I think the biggest thing to prove that is to just go out and see some of this stuff and feel compelled by it.
Excellent. Well, thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Once again, this has been CarlyAnn Anderson, who is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Historic Wyoming. I'm Wiley Combs. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of News from Nowhere. Thanks again to our expert filmmaker, Nid Collins, for helping to spearhead this project and get this sort of information out there. And this is Laramie.